age, was the first to be convicted under the new terrorism laws in Canada. Now, the young man robbed a corner store with the intent of using the money to travel abroad and fight in Syria. Now, depending on whether he will be sentenced as a youth or as an adult, the 16-year-old is facing anywhere from 10 years to life in prison. Now, currently in Canada, like many Western countries, there is no system or plan in place to deal with such an individual. More than simple prison time is needed for this youth. Now, this is what our long-term project will be. It is to identify how an individual was radicalized and then implement proper cognitive behavior therapy amongst other treatments and interventions to ultimately de-radicalize individuals. Now, part and parcel of this plan is to better understand the role played by religion and ideology in violent behaviors and action. So this is what my colleague and I have decided to tackle since 2013 from a multidisciplinary perspective. Radicalization and terrorism is a multifaceted problem that must be faced from the perspective of the hard and social sciences. Therefore, Dalia and I have decided to tackle this problem together by offering our expertise in our respective fields of neuroscience and of religious studies to help those who are at risk of being radicalized and decondition those who have been radicalized. However, first we must construct a mapping of this process, which is based on gene and environment interplay. Now, our mapping at this point resembles this. Our goal is to discuss one specific element in this thorough mapping, that of religious ideology. Now, one of the distinguishing features of international terrorism of the past 15 years has been the resurgence and proliferation of terrorist groups motivated by a religious imperative. Such groups are far more lethal than their secular counterparts, regarding violence as a divine duty or sacramental act conveyed by sacred texts and imparted by clerical authority. The lethality of religious ideologies has stemmed from a post-9/11 and 7/7 new terrorism discourse. Particularly in Canada, the US, and the EU, terrorist and radical organizations have been targeting young adults between the ages of 13 and 25, when they are most at risk of being radicalized. In light of the rise of young adults being brought into the fold of terrorist organizations, and either performing terrorist acts at home or leaving to fight in Syria and Iraq, work needs to progress at a faster pace to determine the process of radicalization, prevent it, and de-radicalize those who have already been radicalized. Western society has an important role to play in protecting those most susceptible to this new form of terrorism. Now, it must be stated at the outset, though we're using Islam as an example due to current implications of the Islamic State, this paper is not about Islam as it is practiced in its many varieties in Muslim communities throughout the world. It's not about Islamic fundamentalism or the various Islamic political movements. So what do religious ideologies have to do with violence? Well, let's consider, if we're not talking about Islam as a whole, we're talking about a small group of 40 to 100,000 amongst the 1.2 billion Muslims on earth that carry out and promote terrorism in the name of Islam. So we're talking about the 0.03%. Now, we leave out all other religious, economic, social, politically motivated, radical, extreme, fundamental, and terrorist groups. So religious ideologies are a fundamental part of the new terrorism movement that has emerged in the past 15 years, and it has helped with the recruitment and radical process, and we can see that by the data that's been collected by RAND, if we look at a post-9/11 numbers. Now, the question is, where do these fighters come from? Most come from Middle Eastern countries involved in the fighting. However, part of these jihadists are from foreign fighters from the West. If we look at ISIS right now, there's an estimated 20,000 plus foreign fighters that make up the jihadists in Syria and Iraq. However, most of the terrorist acts performed in the Western world are not perpetrated by these individuals, but rather by homegrown terrorists. If we look at statistics from the US, most terrorist attacks were committed by American citizens. The same can be said for most terrorist acts performed in Canada, the EU, and in Australia. The largest threat are homegrown terrorists, and for most part, the absorption of jihadist ideology by converts and Muslims is an independent process taking place individually or with a small group of friends. In several cases, radical preachers, veterans of various conflicts, webmasters of radical websites, and more generally, charismatic jihadi entrepreneurs act as radicalizing agents, further exposing already at-risk and sympathetic individuals to these ideologies. Most of these individuals are not born violent. Rather, they are conditioned to act in this way by their environment. Western countries must partially carry the blame for this process, as they have created an environment that is rich with the elements necessary to the radicalization process. Moreover, in light of the globalized digital world we live in, The radicalization process is much simpler to achieve. Gone are the days where individuals had to travel for training. Everything one needs to be radicalized and perform a terrorist act is found on the web. So if we look at a group like ISIS, they're a powerful marketing machine. They have weekly and monthly digital publications, thousands of social media accounts, forums, websites, apps, and the list goes on. They're tapped into the power of the digital world and can reach every single person on the planet. But who are they looking for? We've put together a social psychological profile of the new global jihadists. Now, generally, the idea of today's terrorism is viewed as a hybrid threat that could be summarized as a self-feeding social engineering system, which is a combination of armed and informational activities for achieving chaos, stress, fear, and disorder, providing in this way useful conditions for world social change. Ideology, and in particular religious ideology, is the fuel that feeds this machine. As examples, we could look at statement made that have been made by terrorist leaders and jihadists over the past few years. Now, religious ideologies have a greater explanatory reach than most other ideologies because they address questions of existence, ultimate causality, and absolute morality. Because there are no objectively correct or scientifically verifiable answers to such questions, religious ideologies invoke a rich symbolic and supernatural universe prescribing appropriate emotions and behaviors, but also specify normative practices relating to daily life. Although the framing to a varying degree is in terms of the sacred or the divine, the focus is on everyday life choices and behavioral routines. Most authors who have approached the problem of religious extremism and terrorist organizations have emphasized the group nature of the phenomenon. Part and parcel of this group phenomenon is the central role played by ideology for the group, as well as for the individuals that make up the group, for whom ideology is of prodigious importance. Nehemiah Friedland states that when the ideology of a group is threatened, the concept of ideology can be a real source of deeply felt anger and frustration. Mark Juergensmeyer echoes this as he states that the individuals in a group of religious terrorists sincerely believe that their ideals are under siege. The cultures, in the sense of a social group with an ideology, have the perception that their communities are being violated, and their acts are simply a response to the violence they have experienced. So how does ideology ultimately shape violence? Well, we've come up with 5 dimensions that relate to the role of ideology. And the first is temporal. The temporal dimension of ideology is represented by the amount of time spent with peers. This aspect is important in conversion or recruitment stages, where individuals will begin on general websites such as Facebook, Reddit, and when their opinions start getting banned or censored, they're going to start moving to other websites, other forums, with peers that have similar ideas. On that, you get the mob psychology, where they try to outdo each other, where they're valorized for radical ideas, and the next one tries to be more radical and more radical. And it's on there where these recruiters look and try to find individuals. But you build a social and emotional bond with these people over time. And this creates contextual cues that are typically associated with religion. And this motivates what we call pro-social behavior. And it's independent of religious predisposition. So in other words, religion promotes prosociality. However, this effect is not due to intrinsic religiosity, but an artifact of contextual cues. So since most religions involve doctrine pertaining to the moral domain of human behavior and provide ample mythological examples that act as primes, which may similarly trigger semantic associations with social norms related to the group's desired behaviors, we could use an example, the ideological justification through the reference of sacred register of jihad as an example of this. The third is emotional. And emotional is divided into 2 sections. First off, is related to the temporal aspect. Attachment to others is the first dimension emotional bond. So when a member of a terrorist group are very close to one another, the fear of challenging shared values and consequently losing the esteem and friendship of comrades increases. A second dimension is that a threat towards a religious ideology has an emotional effect as members wish to protect a collective identity built over time and through social relations. The fourth dimension of the ideological bond is moral. Now, the content of ideology is extremely important because it indicates what to think and what to do. So, philosophical and goal regulation perspectives propose that humans need moral ideas to guide concrete goals. Without moral ideals, humans can become mired in conflict among all the imaginable possibilities for action. The moral dimension of ideology is formed through an educational process in several phases, culminating in the dehumanization of the enemy. Members kill after he or she has completed an ideological journey in which the victim is stripped of his humanity. The ideology intervenes before acting and not after. The dehumanization of the enemy comes before his physical elimination. So the ideology is the primum movens that unleashes the homicidal fury and not a simple process of a posteriori justification. And finally, there is a ritual aspect. So ritual and ceremony permeates all aspects of terrorism. If we look at ISIS, they prepare the living martyrs and suicide bombers, and they bury the dead ones with these rituals. They videotape and record the last will and testament of these bombers and solidify their commitments to martyrdom. There's the melodramatic music to celebrate the heroism and sacrifice of the martyrs. There's the mourning ceremonies where men receive congratulatory handshakes because their son and daughters have achieved eternal salvation. There's posters on the wall, electronic links on websites that immortalize these people. All these actions are undertaken repeatedly, routinely, and with procedural rigor. These practices idealize the act of martyrdom and elevate its underlying values in the eye of potential recruits to inspire future missions. So ritual and ceremony imbue acts of extreme violence with meaning, purpose, and morality. Violence becomes a vehicle to uphold one's religious values and proves one's self-worth. It transforms cruel terror into sacred missions in the mind of potential militants and their sympathetic observers. Now, these were environmental factors. However, now we have some genetic factors that Dalia will be explaining to you guys.
So, can neuroscience and evolutionary biology illuminate long-standing questions about the penchant for violence among human beings? Well, the anatomy of the brain is much clearer and meaningful when you examine it in light of its evolutionary processes that created it. The most efficient model for understanding the brain in terms of its evolutionary history is the widely accepted brain theory proposed by Ball-MacLean called the triune brain. This model meshes with the very old conception of three basic elements of human nature, which are will, emotion, and rationality. This model proposes that the human brain is really three brains in one, a triune brain. Those three brains emerge in succession in the course of evolution. This led MacLean to develop a hierarchical view of the brain, describing it from the oldest to the newest brain structures. The brain can either work together or fight it out with each other. For our target group, the adolescent years are noted to be a time of dramatic changes in the body and behavior. It is also the time when the plastic brain undergoes the most changes. Consequently, different rates of development of those three brain areas can lead to increased risk-taking behavior and, more importantly, poor decision-making. From an evolutionary perspective, MacLean labeled the oldest part of the triune brain the photoreptilian brain. The reptilian brain controls the body's vital functions, such as breathing and heart rate. More importantly, the photoreptilian brain is responsible for basic habits related to primitive survival skills. It is no surprise then that the adolescent brain is composed of mechanisms that were selected over evolutionary history in response to the problems that are faced by our ancestors, such as using violence to ensure survival. The paleomammalian brain, or the limbic system, is responsible for what are called emotions in human beings. The main structures of the limbic brain are the hippocampus and the amygdala. From an evolutionary perspective, the limbic brain is the seat of the valley of judgments that we make, often unconsciously. In return, those judgments strongly influence our behavior. In the heat of the moment, decision-making among adolescents can be overly influenced by emotions, because their brains rely more on the limbic system than the cognitive prefrontal cortex. So during adolescent years, the amygdala may give rise to new experiences such as aggression and rage. MacLean labeled the newest part of the brain the neocortex. This part of the brain generates higher cognitive functioning, reasoning, and logical thought. Inside the neocortex lies the frontal lobes, which are structures that coordinate higher order cognitive processes, which allow an individual to pause and assess a situation, to assess his or her options, and to plan a course of action, and finally to execute it. This region of the human brain is the last section to fully mature among adolescents. Damage or underdevelopment of the prefrontal cortex can lead to poor regulation of impulses and emotions, leading to violence, which can undermine judgment and decision-making, qualities that are observed in radicalized individuals. More importantly, during the adolescent years, the limbic system comes under the control of the prefrontal cortex, allowing individuals to have a greater sense of impulse control. As a slight illustration, we can see that the degree of maturation for the prefrontal cortex tends to take longer than the degree of maturation for the limbic system. However, the prefrontal cortex fully develops after your adolescent years. Until then, our emotions tend to empower our logical reasoning, making adolescents vulnerable to poor decision-making. But can we solely rely on science to explain our behaviors? And the answer is no. The standard social science model assumes that organisms come into the world largely as a blank slate, which is written on by experience. Experience completely influences the directions and choices that a person makes. Those who have adopted this view has emphasized the plasticity of humans and the ability to learn and unlearn almost any human processes. An opposing view assumes that humans come into the world with a variety of programs that are already built into our systems. Many of those programs are modified by our environmental experiences. This proves that human beings are more than just inborn processes, in the same way that they are more than environmental influences. Evolutionary psychologists do not argue that behaviors have evolved, but rather that psychological mechanisms have evolved. Many of these mechanisms produce behavior, but only in response to specific environmental input. Consequently, since violent behavior are potentially very costly, evolutionary accounts should not only expect these behaviors under very specific conditions, but also under specific environmental inputs. But how do genes and environment interact together to shape our human behavior? Both equally play an important role. A general fear held by many humans is that their behavior is solely predetermined by their genetic makeup, which is your complete heritable genetic identity. Evolution has acted so that genes capture the evolutionary responses to selection on particular behaviors that are crucial for survival. The environmental context, on the other hand, is the surroundings or conditions in which a person operates. A person's interaction with their environment gives them their ability to adjust or tweak their behavior during their lifetime. Moreover, some environmental effects may be seen under only certain genetic conditions, which may only be seen under certain environmental conditions as well. So as we can see, this is not a causal nor a linear relationship. The contribution of genes and environment varies among individuals. In many cases, gene and environment act independently, but also interact to produce a wide range of behaviors. Nonetheless, an individual may have a genetic predisposition to violent behaviors, but may not show his or her trait unless he or she experiences environmental risk factors at an early age. Some environments serve as a protective factor and prevent future behavioral problems among humans, whereas others can amplify the risk of acting on those particular behaviors. By itself, the genetic makeup of an individual is only a small proportion of the risk involved in violent behavior. The child's brain does not develop in a vacuum. The influence of the environment on the developing brain is crucial. Enriched environments can influence synaptic connectivity, not only during early development, but also in early adulthood. So the big question, given what we know scientifically about religion and science, what are the prospects for reducing violence in the human experience? There are plenty of forms of interventions that exist, from pharmaceutical to behavioral therapies. Nonetheless, some interventions tend to be short-term, whereas others tend to be long-term, one of them being cognitive behavioral therapy. This type of intervention holds that maladaptive cognitions contribute to the maintenance of emotional distress in behavioral problems. Basically, maladaptive cognitions include general belief or schemas about the world or the self. The main goal of this therapy is cognitive reconstructing, to help a person learn to recognize negative patterns of thought, evaluate their validity, and replace them with healthier ways of thinking. Cognitive behavioral therapy assumes that changing maladaptive thinking leads to a change in affect and behavior. The core premise of this treatment approach holds that maladaptive cognitions contribute to the maintenance of emotional distress in behavioral problems. In order to have a good model of cognitive behavioral therapy, we need a cognitive behavioral assessment to take place among individuals. There are 4 steps that are critical to assessing an individual as a whole. The first step involves identifying the critical behaviors. Step 2 involves determining whether critical behaviors are excesses or deficits. Step 3 entails obtaining a baseline. This means evaluating critical behaviors for frequency and duration. Step 4, the aim is to decrease the frequency, duration, or intensity of behaviors if there's an excess of them.
So, religious ideologies are but one of the environmental factors that interact with genetic and neurological factors. Our mapping shows that there's others that have yet to fully be explored. We started this a year and a half ago, and it's a very, very big project. Once we have built a complete model of the environmental factors, our future work will involve to identify the behaviors that are associated to radical and terrorists, and which part of the mapping are associated to these behaviors. We're not limiting only to Islamic terrorists. This is to apply to Christian, Judaic, to be applied to non-religious ideologies as well. This is a larger project. It's just how research and media is working now. Islamic terrorism is a lot easier to research with. So ultimately, our goal would be to work with psychiatrists and other therapists to create the first necessary diagnostic tools, and then to implement cognitive behavioral therapy to prevent as well as to decondition these individuals, which is also applicable, as I said, to a variety of radicals and terrorists. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's take one question and then we can continue with the panelists if people would like to chat. Yes?
Thank you for that. You started one of the initial things you pointed to is the way in which the environment in the West, the way you characterize it, as being particularly conducive to, radical views being promulgated and so forth, and so forth. An omission which to me is a striking omission is the so-called war on terror itself as contributing to this environment. Just one figure. In March of last year, the Washington DC-based Physicians for Social Responsibility released a landmark study concluding that the death toll from 10 years of the war on terror since the 9/11 attacks is at least 1.3 million and could be as high as 2 million. And this was conducted by Nobel Peace Prize winning doctors group based in DC. So the media doesn't like to talk about these things. These figures, with due respect, it seems to me that the Muslim radical is being constructed in a dehumanizing manner in your account, which as a discourse I understand where this comes from, but I'm not sure what the end result of that will be.
Well, the end result is part of the psychological profile of the people that these jihadists are looking for, because they're not only looking for people there to fight and defend their countries, but they're looking with people who have a beef with the West. So if you're looking, like the research that came out of the UK, July 2015, they have a similar project with CBT called Channel. They have one in Netherlands called Diamond. But these programs belong to the government and they're very secretive. But what they do release is that they're doing research on second and third generations Muslims. So they're looking at people, one, who have identity issues, where they're not necessarily Arab or Muslim because they're living in the West, but they're not necessarily Westerners either because they do have their Muslim identity. So they're looking for people with a struggle. If you're adding to that how the Western medias build ideas of what the common Muslim is or common Arab is, well, depending if you're watching Fox and CNN, if you're watching the BBC, you're going to get two different images. Mass media is watching more what Fox and CNN says, so you're looking at the idea of, well, we're going to push aside everyone because everyone's going to fit this model. It's you're creating a terrible, terrible environment where if you fit the right environmental conditions and the right psychological factors, neurological factors, then you're the one that they're going to go pick out. And that's more like how we're talking about it's specific factors, and this is like, I haven't even touched globalization, I haven't even touched the media, I haven't even touched the internet. This is just religion in like a very, very small part.
Or Islam, really.
Yeah, and it's just Islam, but we can do the same with Christians, we can do the same with Jews, we can do the same with Buddhists. It's
but
not.
People really aren't doing that. And they say, with due respect to one other point, the sort of factors that go into ideology we identify as temporal, pro-social, emotional, moral, ritual, from a kind of, just given my training, Talal Asad I mentioned before, he's an anthropologist, sort of, as you were going through that list, I couldn't help but, in my head, turn the table around and apply that ideological framework to secularism, and how you know, secularists, us, you know, wonderful liberals, we construct, you know, our social categories, and we have the in-groups and the out-groups, and who it's okay to bomb because, you know, they deserve being bombed. And so, I mean, I'd be interested to see the same sort of analysis applied to our own sort of assumptions, which, you know, have this universalized positionality. It's universal, therefore it is correct and unquestionable.